Okay, let's make the video now. For those who don't know, it is a common statement that the economy naturally booms and busts. The idea being there's a cycle where the economy will grow over a period called an economic boom, and then it will crash, causing a recession known as a bust. The idea being the economy constantly switches between these booms and busts over time, inevitably, and so the government has to intervene to essentially mitigate the damage. The Keynesians, for example, propose reducing the boom so that the bust doesn't go as deep, and thus essentially minimizing it by compacting how bad it gets. Apologies for the noise, I don't know what that was. Regardless, back to the point. However, I wish to challenge this notion of natural boom and bust. Let's look at the main examples, shall we? Because the whole idea is that an unregulated market naturally goes towards booms and busts. Now, first things first, I'd like to clarify economies aren't going to grow always. That's just a reality. Sometimes there will be things that go down, sometimes there will be things that go up. However, that it's a guarantee of a constant boom-bust cycle is not the case. Unless you mean in the sense of just going up and down. Yes, that will happen, but you cannot say, at least I'm going to argue, you can't say accurately that without the government there's going to be big booms and then recessions that are called busts and then so on and so forth. So let's start with 1837. Now, the biggest thing with it was a credit crunch. There was land speculation, yes, and the cotton prices went too low. That indeed happened, and those hurt, but the biggest thing was the credit crunch, because banks are fundamentally a cornerstone of the economy. What happens with the credit crunch is essentially the banks can't give out credit because they lack it. So with a lack of credit, banks can't give out loans, and so interest rates rise. So the percentage of interest goes up, and thus those relying on variable interest loans or loans that are going to get renewed and thus interest chained tend to basically default on their loans and thus cause issues. But the reason this credit crunch happened in 1837 was for two reasons. One, the specie circular, which was, importantly, a government policy where land could only be bought in hard currency, gold and silver. So I wrote circulation and not circular. Regardless. And two, the loss of the central bank. Now, people will then say, well, the central bank being lost caused this, therefore the government getting rid of it is a bad idea. Now, I'm fine with central banks so long as they have their limits. It's, in my opinion, generally good to have one. But when your bank is actively giving out low interest loans so that this can go down, you're going to cause inflation. Because if interest is not aligned with the reality on the ground, which central banks commonly will cause by making it easier or harder to loan out money, guess what? It's going to cause inflation when you lower it, and it's going to cause defaults when you raise it. Fundamentally, the bank constantly tinkering with interest rates just results in these booms and busts. Because if it controls the interest rates, then it controls how many people can get access to loans. And thus, if the market can't sustain those loans, which usually it can't, because guess what? If you're constantly fiddling with it, the market's not going to be able to actually adapt to it. And so, what happens is, people take out loans, and things grow, and then when the government realizes, oh freak, we've caused a bunch of inflation, they contract the credit, causing interest rates to spike, a bunch of defaults happen, and a bust occurs. What we are describing as the boom and bust cycle natural to economics is really the result of credit crunches in central banking. 1873, on the other hand, that was railroads. That was a railroad bust. And one may say, well, these railroads were independent. Clearly the free market is what caused it. One, no, they freaking weren't. They were government subsidized. Yeah, for those who don't know, in the US, our railroads were heavily subsidized by the American government. In fact, they would actually give them track. It wasn't just, oh, hey, you are a railroad, we're going to give you some money to do your business. No, they would actually give you the land to lay the track, along with territories around the track so that you could sell it later. That is a massive subsidy, and it led to a lot of railroads being built inefficiently and too much to actually be useful for anyone. Because think about it, if you are paid, as the railroads were, per track laid, your interest would be to make long, windy tracks, which plenty did. They would make long, windy tracks that sure weren't efficient, but they were tracks, and the government was happy to subsidize it. And so guess what? That's what they built. But so many of these being built naturally created issues, as one can imagine. And so the market got cluttered, and as things get cluttered, competition increases, and eventually things collapse because the market expanded too fast for what it's able to afford because, again, government subsidies and land grants. The only ones to really get through this easily were those like Rockefeller, who didn't rely on railroads and instead used pipelines largely. I mean, he had trains that he would use as well, but his big thing was the pipelines so that he wouldn't have to pay Vanderbilt, and all the other railroad tycoons. Needless to say, didn't end too well for the tycoons, but the government could now blame them for something they didn't even cause. 1897 again, a lot of issues. One, again, it was a credit crunch. In fact, you could argue was a merge of 1873 and 1837, as it was both a railroad crash and a credit crunch. The railroads again were overbuilt. I wonder why. Oh, right, subsidies. But also, because of constant messing with the currency, people were worried about the value of their money. Similar to the specie circular. Instead of relying on just currency to float, or even just having a central bank that said, all right, every dollar's worth the same, but we're not going to add any more in. What the government was instead doing was moving silver out of the economy and relying purely on gold as the backing for their currency. Well, guess what? That's going to reduce inflation a lot because you're removing, fundamentally, currency from the economy. If you have three things you can use as currency, silver, gold, and paper money, remove one, and now you have two left, well, that's reducing the amount of currency in the market, which is a sudden drop in credit and available spending power. The government essentially added silver into the market and then removed it, and so people panicked, because as one might imagine, a constantly shifting currency is something no one trusts. And so, as a result, a recession occurred. And then, of course, there was just the fact that there's competition from Europe, which would cause credit crunches as well, because they and their banks would also, lend out money, kind of how a bank works. And so, when credit crunches occurred in Europe, it affected the US as well, because, well, when everyone's trading with each other, they get affected by each other. An economy that's interconnected naturally results in such things. But I want you to actually consider this for a second. Every major recession that people talk about when they're like, oh, back in the day when we didn't have any regulations, there were just constant boom busts. One, no, there wasn't. There were recessions, yes. But of the ones that we actually talk about, the ones that actually lasted for any decent amount of time, like 1873, that lasted all the way until 1879, I believe. Could be mixing up the dates, but still. Lasted for a while, and it was literally caused by the government overfunding the railroads. These three were caused by government intervention. These booms are binges. They are excesses of credit, which when they're finally removed or are touched, bust because they physically cannot be sustained. It'd be like if you took out a loan to fund your current lifestyle, and then someone came back and said, oh yeah, by the way, you have to pay that back eventually. You suddenly have this glut of money, so you spend it, and then guess what? Once things start coming due, your money goes down because you have to pay off the credit. You have to pay off the interest. That's what happened. And it happened again and again in the US because of government intervention. It's not like we suddenly started intervening in the Progressive Era. No, the government's been intervening from the start. And those interventions cause more harm usually than good. There was some good, I'll argue, that came out of it. For example, lots of land. But that is about it. A government can exist and it can function within the economy. But the more and more it tries to involve itself with the economy, with the control of credit, subsidies, and what currency is and isn't allowed to be used, the more it will suffer, and the economy as well, because it generates these booms and busts. It is a constant shifting of credit, and thus interest. And so any loans or investments based off said loans will collapse. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Have a good day.